Thank you for tuning in to ICT on PNC, a podcast covering issues that impact the Texas insurance industry. The Insurance Council of Texas is a nonprofit trade association serving the property and casualty insurance industry. We're proud to be the largest state-based insurance trade association in North America. Welcome to ICT on PNC.
Welcome. Thank you for joining ICT on PNC. My name is Albert Betts, Executive Director of the Insurance Council of Texas. Joining me today is Angie Cervantes, our Manager of Legislative and Government Affairs for ICT. Hi, Angie.
Good afternoon.
Well, Angie, as we sit here to record this on Monday, May 24th, we know there's 1 week exactly left in the 87th legislative session. We have somehow survived 133 days almost of the 87th Texas Legislature. And in the last week, there's plenty of work still to be done by our 181 members, of our legislature. So I thought today we'd talk a bit about, kind of what's happened in a very quick, fast overview of when we started in January, how we got to where we are now. And then in the last week, what should our members expect or keep an eye out for? Some of the deadlines that are coming up, because believe it or not, at this time of year, things die by the clock and by the date, because there are certain deadlines the legislature has to follow. So let's run through, talk about how the session has been for PNC. We'll obviously touch on some other legislative priorities that have happened. And some, before we got on, we're chatting about what's still out there that were priorities, some that still have to get resolved this week. So let's back up. 133 days ago, I think we held a podcast beforehand and pontificated on all the things we thought were going to happen this session. And as always, we probably, at best, maybe batted 300 and 400 as to what we thought would happen versus what actually happened. So as you may recall, we sat here at that time with a new speaker incoming into the House. We didn't know committee assignments. We had new members who had been elected to their roles. And so we said, generally, as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, we thought not a really heavy session on property and casualty. Is that your recollection as well?
Yes, I think that we said it's probably going to be focused on COVID and some of those other issues, and it's a redistricting year. And since everything was remote, we thought it would be a lot quieter. Maybe a TWIA bill here or there.
Yeah, TWIA, the four-letter word that always comes up. So the session, you mentioned COVID, and all the things that have passed, and now that we're kind of coming out of it, I forgot to mention, we started off with COVID as the overarching, what do we do? How do you hold a session during COVID? How do you hold meetings? How do you hold hearings? And somehow the legislature made it. I think we had a brief outbreak early on amongst the membership. But generally, things seem to go well legislatively in terms of having people in, having hearings. I know I had to go over once and did a quick COVID test and thankfully passed and was allowed into the building. But a lot of precautions taken, and thankfully that has passed for the most part. We're still obviously dealing with it, but to a much lesser degree now. So the session starts, and early on it seemed to move slowly, probably with all the changes and some of the uncertainties of how the session would work. But immediately we got the list of the governor's priorities, the emergency items, so to speak, and those, type in whatever you want. Those seem to range from dealing with elections and how Texans vote, when they vote, how they vote, etc. And Texans, we love our guns. And so Second Amendment rights and protecting gun rights is a big issue heading into session. And broadband access, right, was the other one because of the need to make sure people had access. As we learned during COVID, all of a sudden we're all online and need the ability to connect and Zoom and attend school, etc. What are some
telemedicine also, I guess, is one of the things he talked about in relation to the broadband as well. Telemedicine and liability protections for COVID.
Defund the police. Yeah, defund the police was the other one. That's right. A big concern since that phrase came out last summer. over the state, making sure that police departments, I guess, weren't, quote, defunded, whatever that term means to you. And so, with those priorities set out, we began again, other than the liability protection for COVID, didn't seem to be really a big emphasis on property and casualty. And one of the first things we waited with bated breath, at least those of us who deal with the legislature and watch it, is the committee assignments. Um, and that determines which committees get to hear the various subject matter. And as a reminder, for insurance issues in the House, it's House Insurance. In the Senate, it's typically Senate Business and Commerce. So once those were out, we were rolling. Probably, what was that, mid-February? Do you recall when those committees came out?
Yeah, it was the end of January, I think, faster than normal, mid beginning of February, and then the winter storm hit.
Yeah, the winter storm. So, the things you can't predict, you don't want to predict. But February 11th, as I recall, I think it's when the storm began. And so as the session started to kick off, started to roll, we had a week of record level cold, record snowfall. And the thing that shifted the whole focus of the legislature, we were without power, many Texans across the state, for a number of days. And we discovered that our energy infrastructure was maybe not as sound as we thought it was. And so kind of describe what that did to the session in the middle of February.
That I think upended the session completely. And there was all of a sudden a shift in focus to the PUC and to how do we keep this from ever happening again. And I think for us and for PNC, I don't think that we imagined when we started the session and we were talking that that the industry would be the first panelist up in House Insurance discussing what we've done for winter storms in the past, but that's where we were.
Yeah, it definitely shifted the focus. And once everything thawed out, I guess around February 17th or 16th or so, you're right.
Literally.
The industry was up before House Insurance answering questions. How will the insurance industry respond to this unprecedented, we heard that word a lot, unprecedented winter storm that hit all 254 counties in the state of Texas? And so real quickly, I think the industry, from what we can tell, based on TDI's data call, the industry has responded very well in terms of handling their customers' claims. Losses already are over $3 billion. So we know it's already at a record level just for a winter storm. But a lot of questions about how does insurance work, given that we didn't get a lot of winter storm claims in the state. A lot of questions about coverage. How are claims paid? How do you prevent fraud? What's in your insurance policy? So the ledge had a lot of questions early on, but I think the industry did a good job of responding and trying to educate them on how water claims work in particular, but also just how coverage worked and things, something that we'll be talking about later, additional living expenses worked, and the different type of policies that are available to Texans. So for a little bit, we were up front, but after that, it was, if you didn't know the name ERCOT, you now know it because most of the session discussed ERCOT and PUC and weatherization of energy plants, energy producers. And then even we spent time, the ledge spent time talking about solar and wind turbine producers. So I'll be honest, from an industry, an ICT and PNC perspective, for a while we were watching someone else take the heat here in the state, ERCOT and PUC. But that issue, I think, there's been various responses to that legislatively, and that focus took up a good chunk of the middle of the session. So let's talk about the PNC side of it. After talking about how we handled the storm and what consumers needed to know and what policies we had here in Texas, there's some issues we knew would come up this session. Probably repeats from last session. You mentioned one earlier, TWIA. TWIA is somehow pops up every single session, even when there isn't a major storm that hit the year before. But what were some of the other issues that we saw a lot of bills on, a lot of discussion on the PNC side?
Right. Early on, we talked about a lot of refiles that we thought would come up, such as OEM, so using auto parts that are from the manufacturer. And this was a bill that's been filed for the last two sessions, and we anticipated that popping up, and it did. But to our surprise, it also popped up in a different way with a different bill that was being pushed by a separate group, by the auto dealers, that we hadn't seen in the past. And UIM, which we had also seen in previous sessions and we knew would possibly pop back up again.
And that's more of a litigation issue, as I recall, correct? So that's about how or when can you sue an insurer. So a big issue of concern, just because of the potential of increased litigation over claims involving and UIM. So yeah, you're right, a big repeat. But the winter storm did raise a couple of issues. One which we anticipated based on some prior storms, and that's replacement costs.
Right. In the
Our,
context of TWIA, but then
right,
it popped
right.
up here. Yeah.
That popped up here. So that became a big point of discussion with an attempt to change how replacement cost is paid and how the policy language should read. And short version of it is ultimately what came out of it was a proposal to require 80% of replacement costs paid as the first claims payment. So a lot of discussion about how does that work? Does anybody else do that across the country? And I know you looked at some research along with some other trade groups on what had happened with Florida, and an example of how that seemed to have driven up rates and caused problems there. And in fact, as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, Florida was actually changing their law to change how those claims payments were made because of problems with the approach they had taken.
Right.
So yeah, so that was a big discussion. What else? Am I forgetting? Oh, yes, additional living expenses. Let's talk a bit about that
Yes.
because it's something, and I think I've told this story before. I had a friend who sadly suffered a significant loss of his home during the winter storm and did not know what ALE was when I mentioned it to him. Turns out he had the coverage. His company obviously took care of him. But talk a bit about how that discussion evolved during the session.
Right. So additional living expenses, and this is going back to also the storm, I think, really brought to the forefront that people did not always know the ins and out of their policies and what is covered and what isn't. And so this bill that was brought up by Representative Ed Thompson, the way he described it was he wanted to ensure that people that had this type of coverage, which is the type of coverage that you get, for example, to cover a hotel if your house is uninhabitable to a covered loss. And so there were some questions at the beginning, and luckily I don't think that turned into any of an issue of we've never had a situation where the power goes out and this is what's causing pipes to freeze and burst. And so Ed Thompson filed this bill, and it I think it's now over in the Senate, but I don't think that it's going to. Time is running out on it, and the bill would essentially require for a covered loss additional living expenses to be paid. So it really, what effect do you think it would have had? It's sort of codifying what's already done, right?
Right. Yeah, it was. If you go back to the original version, which just simply said, in effect, if you were, had loss of power, loss of water for 24 hours, ALE would cover it, or would be covered as an additional living expense. I think the version that passed, you mentioned, ultimately passed the House, did tie it to a covered loss. So it was unclear exactly how the loss of power played into a covered loss situation. So it would have been interesting to see, if it had passed or if there had been further discussion on it. What exactly did it do? If it made any real change, or if it was generally what was already in place when there was a covered loss and you had a policy with ALE coverage in it. So interesting, but an interesting discussion. It was. This was directly an outgrowth of the winter storm because so many people, their loss was attributed maybe not to a tree hitting their home or some damage from the actual ice storm, but it was more so due to the loss of power and the home getting too cold and the pipe freezing. So it did raise an interesting discussion. As you mentioned, it made it over to the Senate, but as we're talking today, its chances no bill is ever dead. We'll talk about that in a little bit. No bill is actually dead
No,
until
don't
certain
call it
deadlines
until.
pass. No, it's still it's very much alive as far as I'm publicly, I would say, but I think its chances are slim at this point. Um, TWIA, real quick, there's a host of TWIA bills filed, which I guess somewhat not surprising, but also somewhat surprising. And some of those range to changing how the board did its business. Uh, One of the bills actually had a change in the whole rate process, would take it out of the hands of the TWIA board and put it with TDI. That bill did make it out of committee, but didn't go anywhere. And then let me back up. There's a couple of interesting things about that bill you may recall, Angie. One of the changes would have made the rate determination or rate standard actually based on the public, I'm trying to remember the exact words now. It's the public interest or the public good in the rate increase. So that
Yes,
would have made for some interesting discussion. How does the public determine if a rate is good or not for purposes of insurance?
right. And I think that that was one of the things that was raised in committee when that bill was brought up was, well, how to, it was vague.
Yeah, yeah, because I know in my own home with 4 cars and a home to insure, I'm very much any rate increase is not in my public good. So I don't think that's probably the standard companies want to go with. But it did put it in the hands of TDI. That was one of the big interesting changes there with that entire rate discussion. There's other bills dealing with their funding. There's other bills dealing with how they determine what their 1 in 100 uh, probable maximum loss level should be. Changes to how they determine or how they use their insurance broker or the reinsurer, how they use CAT models, just a variety of changes that we'll discuss after session in more detail. But this raised a lot of questions about were these actually good, sound approaches to take for an entity with the exposure that TWIA has and the number of policies that they cover. So further discussion on that later. And there's never a dull moment with the Texas Windstorm Insurance Association.
No.
Not at all. And then finally, there was a variety of bills. I think we had an auto appraisal, a bill requiring appraisal as part of the auto insurance policies, personal auto policies. We had some bills dealing with county mutuals, a couple of those, which had a lot of interesting discussion within the industry over, in effect, the role and place of county mutuals and the competition within the industry. But both
Right.
of those bills, at least as we're speaking, seem to have died.
Although
Well,
those bills, I think, are good examples of what we're talking about. We don't, let's not call it yet because for a little bit it looked like one of them had died on a procedural motion and then it got amended onto another bill. And so that bill has since not moved, but it had life
yeah,
a couple of times.
no, you're exactly right. I'm sorry. Let me just say it's out there still. We don't know what's going to happen to it, but it is close to running out of time. So with 1 week left, there's a lot that can happen. As we mentioned earlier, there's various deadlines that loom large, some of which are tomorrow, for example. Sorry, some of which are, yeah, tomorrow.
Tomorrow,
We,
yeah.
I
Tomorrow's the
think
last day that we can that the House can hear Senate bills. So midnight tomorrow, any Senate bill that's over there, it's the last day that they could hear it. And then Wednesday is the last day for the Senate to hear any bill at all. So a couple of
Right.
days away.
Couple of days away, and I think Friday or the 28th is the last day for House to act on Senate amendments that have come over. There's deadlines, I think, on the Saturday, the 29th, for conference committee reports. And so each day this week, in effect, becomes a day where there's something out there you're following or looking at that if that bill is not crossed whatever that threshold is that day, more and more bills end up dying. So um, it bears watching to see what happens. I know we're keeping an eye on a couple of one TWIA bill, which seems to be moving forward, at least as of this weekend, uh, which would House Bill 769, which would make some changes that I mentioned earlier in terms of TWIA purchasing reinsurance from certain insurers or brokers. We'll see where that goes. It's in the Senate and seems to be moving forward, but it is different than the House version. So unless the House concurs in those changes, they would have to appoint a conference committee, and at this late date, again, that becomes questionable. But anything out there that you're surprised that didn't move forward at this point? One bill I think about that's not dead yet. Let me make sure I say that. But Senate Bill 207, which was the paid and incurred
Right. It was
changes.
a priority bill, I think, at the beginning too, for the lieutenant governor at least.
Right. But it is, it was made it out of the Senate. It made it out of its House committee, but it's sitting right now. So that's one to keep an eye on. And then various workers' comp bills. I'm not going to go into detail, but we noticed a lot of the workers' comp related legislation that made it from the House to the Senate either was referred but not heard, or never got referred to a committee. Quite three or four of them, as I recall, that were quote key workers' comp bills. And again, we'll update more detail. But I think we touched on the uninsured motorist litigation bill earlier. Same thing happened with the replacement cost bill. It got to the Senate but was never referred. And anything else that off the top of your head?
No, I mean, I think another thing that did pass that's already on the way to the governor, I think it just passed maybe yesterday, that also was, I guess, tangentially winter storm related, is sunset. So TDI was supposed to undergo sunset this next session, but with all the focus on the PUC and the need to really look at that particular agency, TDI sunset has gotten pushed back. So they'll hear the PUC next session, and then TDI in 2025.
Yeah, already.
So, yeah.
We're already talking about 2025. So yeah,
So
TDI and DWC both pushed back to 2025. So a little bit more time to have fun doing insurance sunset. I think we touched on the auto repair bill, and that was just following Senate Bill 1538, which made it out of the Senate, was referred to the House committee, but no action has happened on that. So just a lot of it's typical session. I mean, you worked legislatively, worked actually in the Senate. I've worked around legislative issues. I don't know how 20 years, making me feel old. 20 years or more, I think, at this
yeah.
point. But as you look at this is typical for the end of session. Things start to die. People are hunting for bills to amend, with maybe some provisions or matters that didn't get added on. So this week we'll spend, and we'll be talking to the other trade associations as well about, as deadlines pass, what's still around. Are there rumors of things being amended? And then as we move towards the 31st, we're all waiting just to see the ledge announce sine die, which means well, it doesn't mean this, but in effect it is the end of session. And we'll move on and start waiting to see what the governor has 20 days after session to sign or veto or let a matter pass by not signing. And so we'll see what happens in that 20-day period. But this has been as always, I was about to say a different session, but every session seems like it ends up being different in some way.
Mhm.
Something comes up, something changes the discussion. The focus is not what you thought it was going to be. And then this last week is they've got to work on, help me remember these, Andy, they've got a budget to finalize this week. I think the gun bill is still out there.
Yeah.
Um, I think the broadband access bill is still pending. And correct me if I'm wrong, with the elections reform passed yet? I think that's still
Still on the
awaiting.
calendar, I think.
I
Yeah.
think that's still awaiting action. So uh, 3 or 4 of the legislative priorities are still there. And as always, the one thing the legislature has to do each session is a budget for the next biennium. So we assume that'll get done. Early on, Andrew, you mentioned redistricting, and we know because of some issues with the census and having all the data ready and available, the Ledge will be back in the fall for a special session on redistricting, and that will also probably be very, very fun uh, to watch members decide that. And I think that's the last big thing I can think of. I will add, I'm sorry, let me add one more thing. And if you want, we can play a game of speculating who it's going to be. But the insurance commissioner, um, the commissioner wasn't appointed prior to session, so we anticipate, not that we have any inside knowledge at this time, but anticipate at some point in the near future, hopefully we'll have an insurance commissioner announced, and maybe we'll get lucky and get him or her on this podcast.
Right. They were too busy appointing new PUC members.
That's true. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
you know what, that's a whole nother discussion about
Mhm.
the PUC various resignations and appointments. I'm just glad I wasn't at PUC during this session or at ERCOT. But anything else? Anything that you looked at when we go back 133 days and go, I can't believe that happened, or there's no way. If you told me that was going to happen, I would have bet you $100,000 that it wouldn't happen.
No, I mean, I think that we always know anything can happen. I do think that we speculated at the beginning that the Senate would have less bills coming out of it and hear less bills, especially PNC related. And just preliminary, when we look at our reports, it does seem like that was the case. They moved less bills than the House did. But it'll be interesting to really look at the numbers and see if it was more of a regular session than we imagined, or if it was a session where there were significantly less bills passed by one chamber versus the other.
Okay, that's a good idea. Yeah, I think we ended up, correct me if I'm wrong, tracking over 400 bills this time,
Yes.
which is about the normal amount of PNC related legislation that we track. So that seems the same, but you're right. Just kind of watching the flow of the session, something was a little bit different, and maybe we can do some analysis afterwards and report on what happened there. So thank you, Angie. That was a quick
Thank you.
review of almost 4 months of 3.5 months of things happening. We'll be back probably in the next couple of weeks and do a quick rundown of what happened, what passed in the end, and what do our members need to pay attention to as they look to implement some of these laws and some of these changes. But as always, appreciate your insight and assistance this session, Angie, and we'll hopefully talk again.
Thank you for listening to this edition of ICT on PNC. Find us online at insurancecouncil.org for more information about our organization or about the property and casualty insurance industry in Texas.